Welcome back. Today we're going to draw Jesus as the Man of Sorrows. This is an engraving by Albrecht Durer, the Northern Renaissance master. And he's in a pose that's pretty close to the reference position. And because he's got that basically the base of the cross behind him, we can see we have a nice reference for a big vertical that we can start with. Even though he's not leaning up against it, it's going to be helpful to just place that there. This figure looks to be about 8 heads tall, and it's sort of an exaggerated contrapposto pose. So what we have is the head is tilted pretty strongly to our left, and it's also shaded very clearly so we can really get a sense of the head as a volume. So I'm going to draw it as a very simplified little robot head with a little shading. That's going to just show me where that side plane is compared to the front plane and show me the angle of the tilt. And we want to allow for that to be about 1/8 of the overall height of the figure. If we mark off heads on this guy, we've got, there's the head, here's the trochanter. We've got about 2 heads in between the trochanter and the bottom of the chin, and we've got about 2 heads from the heel to the knee joint, and about 2 heads from the knee joint to the trochanter. So it's pretty close to a classic 8-head figure. There's a little shrinking right here because this side of the body is slightly compressed, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So we've got the head tilting that way, and we have the rib cage tilting slightly the other direction. We may as well use our Riley method for getting the rib cage. So let's mark the pit of the neck here and draw a very slight angle down to represent the points of the shoulders. And then we're going to measure about 4 heads down to the trochanter. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. And notice because of the turn of the head, the turn of this whole, the twist of this body, I would place the pubic arch right about here. And our triangle that we make is going to have a little bit of a curve to it. You see that? So we've got points of the shoulders, and then we've got this slightly curved triangle as it twists around to the pubic arch. So we end up, and if we drop a plumb line down from the bottom of the chin, we end up just about on the pubic arch. So let's start with that plumb line, and then we're going to draw this slightly twisted triangle form. Then we're going to do the opening at the base of the neck. We can see where the navel is. It's about 1 head up from the pubic arch. So here's the navel. So our rib cage form ends up being sort of pocketed inside this triangle like that. With the sternum, because of that twist, the sternum here has a pretty pronounced slope. It's not vertical. It's sort of perpendicular to the line of the shoulders. So here's the line of the shoulders, and here's the sternum. The Riley method uses this strange kind of wine bottle simplification of the figure. Remember, let me clean this up. We're going to do this weird thing where we visualize like how the muscles of the neck relate to the external obliques, which are here. Remember that? It's definitely a weird thing because there's no anatomical connection, but it sort of can help you get the right kind of flow to your drawing. So you see how this external oblique, that's like the muscle right above the hip bone, right above the iliac crest, is extending down more because there's a tilt, pretty strong tilt to the pelvis, which we're going to visualize as being right here below the navel. And then on this side, we have a much more compressed and elevated external oblique. So we're contrasting, as he did, this curve here with this curve up here. So this type of pose, as I mentioned, is called a contrapposto. And the idea here is that instead of distributing the weight evenly on both legs, as we saw in the reference position drawings that we did before, in a contrapposto, the weight is mostly on one leg. And so you can easily identify the weight-bearing leg is the one that's locked. That's this one. And because it's locked, it's raising the pelvis on this side, and the pelvis on the above the non-weight-bearing leg is dropped because this leg is bent a little. And then because of the angle the pelvis is going this way, the rib cage answers it like that, and then the head answers it like that. So we get this back and forth movement. The other really important thing to understand about this kind of pose is that if you imagine a point centered between the ears, right here, and you pull a plumb line straight down, that's our center of balance. That's going to be above the weight-bearing foot, not the other foot. And it's a lot of people intuit that the center of balance is going to be at this point between the feet, like it was in your reference position drawings. It's not, because the weight is not evenly distributed. The weight is mostly on this foot, and that's why we see the head is centered exactly above this heel. You see that? So we can go ahead and pull that plumb line down so that we know where we're aiming for with our legs. Just go straight down, and I'm going to go ahead and measure center. It's always a good idea just to confirm for yourself, like, where is the center of a figure? So I'm marking the bottom of the heel and the top of the skull, and I'm measuring with my pencil, and as I predicted, the center is right about here. It's where the pubic arch is, which is near the bottom of this little loincloth thingy. You see that? So having found in our drawing, we pretty much know where the pubic arch is. We know where the top of the head is. We can measure this and make sure that we're making the legs long enough. So I want you to do exactly what I'm doing. Use your pencil as a measuring tool and make sure that your top half and your bottom half are the same size. If you get in the habit of doing that every time, you're never going to make your legs too small. Okay. So we've got this raised iliac crest here. I hope these terms are familiar to you now. Coming off the bottom of it are the outsides of some of the gluteal muscles. But what we're interested in mainly is locating the knee at this point, which is going to be halfway between the heel and the pubic arch, the knee joint. And notice that the knee kind of hugs this plumb line that we just made. So I'm going to sketch a simplified little ball for the form of the knee, and then I'm going to connect up to the iliac crest with this big swooping curve of the thigh muscles. And the inner thigh muscles are going to peak a little lower. See that? See, there's the peak of this curve. Here's the peak of this curve. And then these muscles wrap around and come behind the kneecap to insert in the lower leg. And this is something I've talked about before, but it's kind of interesting. Every beginner thinks about limbs like this. And every beginner puts the indentations directly across from each other. And can you see how that doesn't look like it could support any weight? It looks flimsy, and that's never the way the body works. What we always see is if we have an indent on one side, we have a bulge on the other side. There's like a nice rhythm. Indent here, bulge here, indent here, bulge here. So instead of this, we end up with always these indents and bulges are always offset from each other. And that has to do with how we use muscles to move. But you see how much more natural that looks? This isn't even the pose we're drawing, but just using that to illustrate the concept. So here we've got a bulge, here we've got an indent. Working our way down, we've got a bulge in the upper calf. And we've got this bulge is higher up. This one's across from this indent. And we come all the way down towards the heel. And just going to roughly block in the foot. We're not going to deal with that yet. most important thing, you got to end up with this heel below the guy's chin. Okay. I'm going to block in a little bit of the loincloth. And you can see, this is why artists draw naked people, because you can see the loincloth obscures a lot of the anatomy, makes this drawing a little more challenging than it would be without it. But okay, so because the heels are at about the same level, but the pelvis is tipped, this knee is going to end up being a little bit lower than this one. So I'm going to locate that knee, and then I'm going to quickly draw the curve of the inner thigh. And here we're paying attention to the shape formed in between these two legs. That's the negative space idea. Here's the outer curve of the thigh, which comes out about as far to the left as the iliac crest does above it. And the curve of the calf. This is the front surface of the tibia, which you can see very clearly. The skin, as you're probably aware, is very thin through here. And then the muscles of the calf projecting behind it. And block in just a basic shape for this foot. I'm going to come around and look at your work, and just as soon as we block in the arms, we're not going into too much detail anywhere. So these are the trapezius muscles coming up behind the neck. A lot of people have a hard time coping with the fact that the trapezius in a pose like this comes up above the level of the chin, because a lot of people have just done so many drawings like this where they think the the shoulders have to be below the chin, but that's obviously not what we're seeing here. So put that trapezius muscle high enough. The usefulness of doing a copy like this cannot be overstated. When you look at a living person, you have to, it's not the best way to learn anatomy, because you are probably not equipped to really understand the forms you're seeing. When you look at artists' rendering, especially of an idealized figure like this, it's like almost like looking at an écorché, or it's like the muscles are so clearly understood that the artist isn't including anything in the drawing that he hasn't dissected and analyzed and come to a very detailed understanding of. So Before I draw the arms, another concept that I'm going to keep coming back to is the idea of crating, C-R-A-T-I-N-G, which is imagining the smallest envelope or crate that you could fit this figure into, and just looking at that shape. And a lot of the gesture here comes from the asymmetry of that shape. So crating is largely a matter of understanding angles, which is something that I deal with in another class, but you see how this is about a 45-degree angle? So we're going to come down here at about 45 degrees. This is about a 30-degree angle. 30 degrees from horizontal, like this. This is about 30 degrees. That's about 45 degrees. So we're going to come off the top of the head at 45 and at 30. And then we're going to come from the outside of our feet with these much steeper angles, and where the intersections happen, well, I'm going to notice that this hand comes up about as far, just below the pit of the neck. So we're looking for an intersection here, and this hand comes up about halfway between the pit of the neck and the nipple line. So we're looking for an intersection about here. So having found the envelope, we can now sketch the basic forms of the arms, not getting lost in details yet. And try to leave enough room for the hand. Remember how big your hands are when you measured them? 3/4 to 7/8 of a head. So make sure you leave enough room for the arms. So analyzing this gesture feels to me like maybe I brought this point out a little too far, so I'm going to make a quick correction. And that's why it's good that I didn't draw a whole hand yet. You see that at this stage you can easily correct things without sacrificing and erasing a ton of beautiful work. And now I'm a little happier with the overall gesture. The first figure drawing class I took in college was very frustrating for me because we would spend the first half of class doing what the teacher called gesture drawings, which were like 30-second to 2-minute poses. And I didn't have enough understanding of the figure, and frankly, really none of us did, to really make great use of that time. And I think it's frankly kind of a bad way to learn proportion. You want to do a few analytical drawings like we're doing now. Get things right by measuring them and studying them. And once you've really internalized those facts about the figure, then you're going to get a lot more out of a gesture drawing. Once you know how to do that, gesture drawing can be incredibly valuable, but not so much if it's all sort of new to you. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and do the head. Okay, we are now going to draw the face of Jesus. Albrecht Dürer had a funny habit of frequently drawing himself as the man of sorrows. In other words, as Jesus after the crucifixion. So this face is probably based on his own. It's pretty distorted. And don't worry, we're not going to draw those thorns. But let's start with shading the eye sockets. As you can see, my drawing is really small, so I'm not going to try to do much detail here. The eye sockets are a little high because the mouth is open and we're looking up at the head. So one thing I always like to really check is the angle of the nose. You see how it's a little bit, it's sloping about 1 degree opposite the direction you're going to want to make it. You're going to want to make it like this because that's what noses look like. But this is actually, because of the tilt of the head, it's actually going slightly the other way. So be really careful not to slope it out the way you're going to want to do it. And then we're going to pop a little shadow under the nose. And look at how that mouth is sort of like twisting around towards us very unnaturally. I'm just going to represent that as another little dark. And I'm going to show this curve of the eye socket and the curve of the cheekbone, which is peaking way down below the tip of the nose. And the beard. And a little shadow under the bottom lip. And now I'm going to get more specific on the shadow map of the side of the face. See how this shadow curves up around the cheekbone and really defines the side plane of the face. That's not an accident. If he had a model or a mirror, he would have set up the light like this in order to show Now, you may be wondering about shading direction here. What you're going to notice is that the shading goes all different directions. It's not possible to tell from this image if Durer was right-handed or left-handed. And that's because this is an engraving, it's not a drawing. And so as he worked on it, he would have been scratching, digging grooves into a piece of metal with a sharp tool, and he would have been rotating the metal as he worked. So he would have, so there's no consistency to the shading direction. And when you see artists who draw that also vary their shading directions that way, it's usually because they've copied a lot of engravings or studied a lot of engravings. So we're gonna draw this ear way out, kind of level with the bottom of the nose and the top of the eye. And I'm gonna just do a real hint at the gaze. Just put some darks in those eye sockets. And I told you we wouldn't draw the thorns, but we've got to do something with all this. So I'm just going to block in their basic forms. So did Durer study thorns? Obviously. Is this a drawing of an actual crown of thorns? I would say not. Does not look like he fabricated this crown in his studio and had somebody wear it. It feels very invented, and that's part of the power of this drawing is Durer's powers of invention. They look much more kind of alive and snake-like and scary than an actual crown of thorns would look, in my opinion, although I've never had occasion to make a crown of thorns. This hair is also feels very invented, like hair doesn't tend to really do this. It's Durer, like Leonardo, was interested in the movement of water, and it feels more like literal waves. But if you don't get stressed about these details, basically. And if you're falling a little behind, you don't have time to put in the details at all, that's okay too. So one way to learn anatomy is to do a copy like this, and as you're doing it, get an outside reference from an anatomy textbook to see or an app to see what you're drawing. These muscles are the sternocleidomastoidus muscles that insert up here behind the ear and then come down and connect to the sternum and to the clavicle or the collarbone. Here's the top surface of the collarbone. Here's the curve of the deltoid muscle on both sides. The nipple line is tilted at about the same angle as the shoulders. And nipples do not face directly forward because the rib cage is curved, so the metaphor sometimes used as for headlights is misleading. They are angled, they each angle out slightly on males or females. So over here, this is the rib cage. This second bulge behind it is the bulge of the latissimus dorsi, which is one of the major back muscles. So that's creating that fullness behind the rib cage. And we also have a compression fold here. You see how the skin bifurcates here, and the external oblique is all bunched up against the latissimus, and then the pelvis is bunched up under the external oblique. And those compression folds really emphasize, I think he's exaggerated them, but they help to emphasize the twist of the body. And on the other side, you see how he's taken the same curves and everything is much more flattened out. So here's a little hint of the latissimus. There's the rib cage. There's the much flatter external oblique coming down a little further, and then the iliac crest. I feel like I put my loincloth a little too high up. Yeah, it's going to top out about here. And here's the famous six-pack. So that's the abdominal muscles with a little crease twisting down the middle. The upper section and the middle section peaking right above the navel, and then the lower section coming all the way down towards the loincloth. I normally would have done a little more shading early on in this drawing, but let's go ahead and notice that everything there's a shadow edge that falls right along here. It gives the rib cage a sense of volume. And I really goofed here because I need to show the way the arm muscle here is overlapping the latissimus. Okay, here's where the deltoid intersects with the bicep right here. There's the bicep. We're going to have to go pretty fast through these arms. If you're not versed in the lore, you know, it was conventional to show the stigmata, which are the wounds from the crucifixion and the risen Jesus. So he's got a hole in his hand. And some of you also probably know what this wound here is where one of the soldiers charged with administering the execution poked him to make sure he was dead. Okay, so we're going to go back to that box idea with the hand. So here's where the wrist ends. There's our little box. And then we're going to throw some fingers onto the end of the box. Fingers are really fun to draw once you can do them almost without looking, and they're really a pain to draw when you don't understand the form. So you just have to draw literally hundreds of hands, and they start to get pretty fun and easy. Like playing a complicated chord on a guitar. So don't worry if your hand looks messed up. We have to just keep moving here. There's the other deltoid, the other bicep. To do this engraving justice in a copy would obviously take like all day. So this is sort of a what's called a free copy of this. It's an analysis, but it does not pretend to be a close copy. And a close copy, which would obviously be worth doing, you would try to reproduce every line of the original, including line direction. But as I said, that would take a very long time. So there's the box of the hand on this side, and little fingers. Again, don't stress about it. And working our way down. We could have spent this entire class just drawing the loincloth. Durer was unrivaled, I would say, at representing fabric. And we are not going to try to do all that. I am going to shade this side down. People obviously can only stand still for 20 or 30 minutes at a time in a pose like this at the most. And supposing Durer had a model and the model was wearing something like this, you have to realize that every time the model was to take a break, the fabric all would rearrange itself. So it becomes impossible to represent accurately, in that short amount of time that you're going to see it any given way. That's one of the challenges of a clothed figure. you know, when a nude figure gets back into a pose, you're seeing almost exactly what you were seeing before the break, but when a clothed figure takes a break and gets back to the pose, everything changes. And one way artists used to get around that was they would have life-size mannequins. So they would dress a mannequin in the fold with the fabric or the clothing and do the clothing from that, because mannequins don't need to take breaks, obviously. And sometimes they would even put starch on the cloth to stiffen it so that it retains the folds, the shape, the forms of the folds even better. But that can also create a kind of a lifeless feeling. This fabric feels, it doesn't feel rendered that carefully from observation, in my opinion. It looks more invented by someone who had studied it so long that he could just compose fabric the way Jackson Pollock could compose drips, if that makes any sense. And that's really the wonder of this kind of realism to me, is like, I came from an abstract expressionist background, and I always thought realism would have to be much more kind of stiff and boring than abstraction, because abstract painters can just put big blobs of paint wherever they feel like. And when I started looking carefully at drawings or engravings like this and realized that these artists were composing with foliage and with fabric and hair, all these organic forms of nature, they were composing as freely as an abstract expressionist would compose with big drips and splashes of paint. And yet doing so in a way that was so much more visually interesting and accessible and meaningful, because it represented aspects of the familiar visual world. That's when I quit abstraction forever. Okay, before we run out of time here, we are going to try to understand what's going on with these feet. In the last project we did, I told you to think of feet as the outline of a country before you think of it as a foot, because if we break this down into an abstract shape, like this is not something that most of you would recognize as a foot. Right? It's nothing like your cartoon image of a foot, and neither is the other one. Like, let me outline this. So the best way to draw feet is really to understand all these structures and the anatomy. But before you have taken the time to do all that, and it's pretty complicated, your best shot is going to be just to try to copy the shapes. I am going to point out one thing, that the ankles, these shapes are really important to notice, the ones on the inside are a little higher, and the ones on the outside come down a little lower. We can't really see the outside one on this foot. So let's start there. Maybe I can zoom in a little more. No, I can't. So we've got this curve here. And then I'm going to draw this shape, which we call blocking it in. And it might be useful to just create this, like if I know where the outside of that calf is, that'll help me determine about how far the toes come out. And sort of like that. And the other one, look at the energy created by this weird, there's this big gap between the big toe and the rest of the toes. It's almost like he's gripping the earth with his toes. And fingers and toes are one place where details become kind of essential, because if you look carefully at that big toe, so here's the form of the toe. It's really hard to make sense of what you're seeing there until you draw the toenail in there, and it's the curve of the toenail and the foreshortening. You see the way that form allows us to read what's like which way the toe is facing. And you see the toe next to it. Now that the nail is further to the left, and it shows that this toe is facing the other way. So usually we don't have to pay a lot of attention to details that small, but on fingers and toes they become pretty important. And it also helps to put a little shading next to the feet, if you can see some, because that kind of anchors the figure to the ground. And I'm going to shade a little bit of this tree, just because the shading is so beautifully done. Albert Durer was probably one of the most important printmakers who ever lived, and probably the most amazing engraver who ever lived. And it's kind of interesting that, like, he came of age when the printing press was a new invention. And but he was able to exploit that technology because his father was an engraver in the time before printing presses. And if you're wondering what engraving was done before printing presses, it was decorative, ornamental engraving on armor mostly. Like if you go to the Metropolitan and you see suits of armor, they have beautiful designs engraved on them. So that was the profession that Durer was originally trained to be in, and then when they invented artistic engraving, he was perfectly well placed to succeed at it. So when you do a careful kind of analytic drawing like this, the last step is sort of take a step back from your work, as I'm doing virtually here, by making things smaller on the screen, and see how you did with the gesture and the proportions. Like I can see I made my hands a little too big, but I'm pretty happy with the gesture. And it's not time, obviously, to make big corrections, but you want to just take a mental note of any errors that you may have made and try to avoid those mistakes next time, because guaranteed, like, there's a pattern to all our errors, and by becoming aware of those patterns, we can avoid them next time. And I'm just trying to do a little detail, really just to show how sunken and hollow those eye sockets are. Okay, I'm going to say goodbye to my viewers on YouTube and take a look at your work. Thank you for watching.